All right, so you've brought us some fascinating excerpts this time. The report of the Iraq inquiry, you said, sections 50, 61, 62. Sounds like you're really digging into the UK's military strategy in those final months before the Iraq War kicked off.
Yeah, those sections are key. Really get into the nitty-gritty of the UK's military planning.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Diving into the details. So, where should we even start with something as massive as the Iraq inquiry? I mean, it's a behemoth.
Well, since your excerpts are laser-focused on the military side, I think we have to start with the UN. Resolution 1441, to be precise.
Hmm.
There was a huge debate about whether it actually gave the green light for war if Iraq didn't play ball.
Right, Resolution 1441. I remember that being a big deal back then, but it's a bit hazy now. Refresh my memory. What was the UK's position on all of that?
Well, publicly, they were all about Iraq needing to cooperate fully, really hammering home that there would be consequences if they didn't. The inquiry actually points out how they used that phrase, cooperate fully, very deliberately. It meant even a minor slip-up from Iraq could be a big problem.
Ah, so setting the bar high, making it clear that any funny business wouldn't fly. But behind closed doors, I'm guessing things weren't so cut and dry.
Exactly. The inquiry excerpts reveal some fascinating internal discussions. Some within the UK government were arguing that any breach of the resolution, big or small, was grounds for war. But others were saying, hold on, it has to be a material breach, a really significant violation.
A legal tightrope walk, it sounds like. Trying to appear tough, but also leaving some wiggle room. What was Blair's take on all of this?
He was very aware of the legal complexities. The inquiry actually quotes him directly, emphasizing that going through the UN was a very conscious decision. He wanted Saddam disarmed, no doubt, but he wanted the weight of the international community behind it. So yeah, they were preparing for military action, but that international legitimacy was crucial for them.
Makes sense. Having the UN in your corner, that's a powerful thing, politically and ethically. Kind of like, if you're arguing with someone, it's more convincing if you've got witnesses backing you up, right?
Exactly. And the UK knew how important its appearances were. But while this whole legal debate was going on, they were also busy with the practicalities of, well, planning a war. Which brings us to something you highlighted in your notes, the northern option.
Ah, yes. Deploying troops through Turkey to secure northern Iraq. That was an ambitious strategy, if I recall.
It was. And logistically, it had its advantages. Securing the north, you could control oil fields, maybe contain Iraqi forces, even potentially open the door for wider international involvement, which was something the UK was really keen on.
Trying to shape the chessboard before the first move, fascinating. So what happened? Why abandon the north?
Well, the inquiry reveals a few snags. First off, Turkey wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of being a launch pad for a massive military operation. They were hesitant, to put it mildly.
And if that went down well in the war planning rooms, any other issues cropping up?
Logistics were another headache. Getting that much firepower and personnel through Turkey, it was a logistical nightmare. And then there was the issue of America's timetable. They were the big dog in this fight.
Right, the U.S. was calling the shots. The inquiry documents, did they say anything about how the UK felt about potentially missing the U.S.'s timetable with this northern option?
Oh yeah, that was a real sticking point. They were committed to this northern strategy, but the idea of going it alone, missing the U.S. timeline, it really worried them. Speaks volumes about their priorities.
Walking a tightrope again, trying to balance their own goals with the realities of being, well, the junior partner. Makes you wonder how comfortable they really were with that dynamic.
That's the million-dollar question. And this tension, this balancing act, is what leads them to a pivotal decision. They shifted focus, decided to go south.
So North is out. It's like they're at a crossroads, and going south, joining forces with the U.S. down there, well, that's where things get really serious.
No doubt. Shifting south, it was a game changer. And the inquiry really digs into the risks. We're talking a much bigger area to be responsible for, higher chance of casualties, and then the whole challenge of, what happens after the war in Iraq. Because it wasn't just about winning, it was about, well, winning the peace too, right?
And that what comes after part, that's where things always seem to get messy. Planning a war is one thing, but planning for peace, that's a whole other can of worms.
You hit the nail on the head, and your instincts are right on the money. Because Section 62 of the inquiry, which you flagged in your notes, it tackles this head-on. Planning, or the lack of it, when it came to a post-Saddam Iraq.
Okay, so Section 62, that's where the rubber meets the road. What kind of stuff are we talking about here? Did the UK even have a vision for Iraq after Saddam was gone?
That is the million-dollar question. And the inquiry, it paints a pretty interesting picture. There's this memo, January 2003, super revealing. It lays out these big concerns within the UK government about going south, and not just the military risks either.
Oh. Like what? Give me the rundown.
They were wrestling with some biggies. How do you get international support for the aftermath? What happens to the country once Saddam's out of the picture? How you even begin to set up a stable Iraqi government? And of course, there's the whole issue of humanitarian aid, dealing with potential pushback from the Iraqi people.
Sounds like they were about to be handed the keys to a very fragile, very complicated car. And no owner's manual.
Spot on. And to make things even more interesting, their own Ministry of Defense, the MOD, they start waving some red flags about whether the UK could actually handle the long-term commitment of rebuilding Iraq.
Wait, so even the military guys were like, guys, are we sure about this?
Pretty much. The MOD was very clear. The UK didn't have the resources to go it alone. Not even close. They needed partners for the short term and the long haul. Problem was, those partnerships were far from guaranteed, especially without a clear UN mandate for the occupation.
Which brings us back to that whole legitimacy thing. It's like they were building a house, but the foundation was still, a work in progress. And speaking of building, well, rebuilding, the UK had their own ideas about how that should work, right? They had experience with Bosnia.
Exactly. Bosnia was a big influence on their thinking. They were leaning towards something called a sectorized approach for Iraq.
Sectorized approach, right. But for those of us who don't speak fluent military, what does that even mean?
So basically, you divide Iraq into different zones, and different countries take charge of things like reconstruction security in each zone. It's what they did in Bosnia, and they saw it as a potential model for Iraq.
A kind of divide and conquer, but the goal is rebuilding, not conquering.
Yeah, you got it. But there was a slight hitch. The U.S. weren't exactly sold on this whole sectorized thing.
Because the U.S., with their experience in Afghanistan, they were more into a centralized approach, right?
Bingo. They had their way of doing things. And it created some friction. But it wasn't just the how of rebuilding that was a concern. The MOD, they also had some, well, financial worries they weren't afraid to voice.
Oh, money talks, as they say. How much are we talking about here?
The inquiry actually quotes some figures from the MOD, and they're eye-opening. They said straight up, committing to a southern deployment, it could cost the UK upwards of £1 billion.
$1 billion with a B. That's a hefty sum, even for, national security.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Really underscores the magnitude of what they were getting into. A huge financial burden, no guarantees of success, and to add another layer of complexity, there were the moral issues, especially when it came to...
Yeah, the human cost. It's easy to get lost in the strategy and forget about the real people involved.
Absolutely. And it weighed heavily on the UK throughout this whole process. The inquiry, it really highlights how much they grappled with this.
So it wasn't just, brushed aside as an unfortunate but unavoidable part of war.
Not at all. There's actually a record of a meeting, January '03, where Blair directly asks his advisors about minimizing civilian casualties, especially during the air campaign. He wanted to make sure they were doing everything they could to be precise, targeted, avoid unnecessary damage.
Trying to square a circle, right. Taking out Saddam, but with, a moral compass.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the unknown. The inquiry mentions this assessment from March 2003. They were worried about things like, what if this sparks civilian uprisings? What about reprisals against people seen as siding with the West?
So even with the best laid plans, there's always that element of, chaos, the what-ifs that can throw everything off course.
It's exactly. War is unpredictable. That's the nature of it. But, okay, leaving aside those unknowns for a sec, let's talk about the UK's actual military role. What were they thinking in terms of how their campaign would work alongside the U.S.?
From these inquiry excerpts, it seems like they were very aware of the need to be in sync with the U.S., especially after committing to that southern deployment.
You're spot on. And they weren't content to just, be following along. The documents mention a meeting, early January 2003. They're already dissecting the U.S. plan, talking about what role they want to play. Ideally, a clearly defined area of responsibility, maybe at the divisional level.
So they wanted a say in how things were going to happen, not just be told what to do.
Exactly. They wanted to make a real contribution, show their capabilities, but also they were aware of their own limitations. Didn't want to overextend themselves.
That balancing act again. Pulling their weight, but not biting off more than they could chew.
And here's where things get interesting, because the inquiry actually reveals that the UK had some doubts about the U.S. plan.
Oh, spilled tea.
So there's this record of Blair. He's pressing for more information about how the U.S. would handle a defense of Baghdad. Like, What if Saddam digs in, turns it into a fortress? What's the plan then?
Even as allies, they weren't afraid to ask the hard questions.
Nope, they weren't just going along blindly.
Hmm.
And there's another moment. A senior UK military figure, Major General Fry, he expresses concern that the U.S. might ask the U.K. to spearhead the initial assault, the bridgehead, and then basically step aside, let the U.S. take over for the main push.
Ouch. Do all the hard work and then get sidelined. That's gotta hurt.
Right. It shows you the power dynamics at play. But in fairness, the inquiry also says the U.S. was providing crucial logistical support. So it was a two-way street, like most alliances.
Give and take with a side of strategic maneuvering.
Exactly. And speaking of maneuvering, we can't forget the whole legal side of this. The UK government was really going through it, trying to justify going to war, especially without that second UN resolution.
That had to be a high-wire act, keeping the public on board, maintaining that international legitimacy, while preparing for a war that, let's face it, was controversial.
It was. And the inquiry gives us some clues about how they tried to pull it off. It digs into the advice they were getting from the Attorney General, the top legal advisor.
So what did the Attorney General say? Was it a thumbs up for war?
Not so simple. There was a lot of back and forth uncertainty. But then, in March 2003, just days before the invasion, the Attorney General gives his formal advice: military action, legal, based on Resolution 1441.
But I'm betting there were some caveats.
You bet. He made it very clear. The UK had to show, without a doubt, that Iraq was breaking its obligations under the resolution. They needed a rock-solid case.
Couldn't just say they're not cooperating, had to prove it.
Absolutely. And they had to show that military action was truly necessary, proportionate, all above board legally. It all ties back to those moral questions we were talking about.
Threading a very, very fine needle with this one.
Perfect analogy. And really, these inquiry excerpts, they give us a peek behind the curtain, right? All the planning, the strategy, the moral dilemmas. It's heavy stuff.
It really is. And honestly, going through this with you, it's been eye-opening. You can read the history books, but to see the details, the decisions, how it all unfolded, it hits different.
I totally agree. It reminds you that history is messy. It's not black and white. There are always different perspectives, unintended consequences.
Definitely gives you a lot to think about. And I have a feeling that's exactly what you were hoping for when you brought these documents to us. A chance to really dig in, ask the tough questions.
Because even with all the information in the world, there are still unanswered questions.
Yeah.
Debates that go on to this day. But hopefully this deep dive, it's given you, the listener, some food for thought.
Because history isn't just dates and names. It's about choices, actions, consequences. It's on us to learn from it, debate it, try to make sense of it all.
Couldn't have said it better. And on that note, I think we've successfully navigated this labyrinth of information. Until next time.